Hello, and welcome back to Bedtime History. Tonight we are going to talk about one of the most powerful, most studied, and most argued over figures of the 20th century. A man who was born in a village so small that most people in his own country had never heard of it, and who eventually controlled the lives of more human beings than anyone else alive at the time. His ideas were printed in a little red book carried by hundreds of millions of people. His face was on every wall and every classroom in an entire nation. He remade China completely, and in doing so, changed the shape of the modern world. His name was Mao Zedong, and the story begins, as so many enormous ones do, in a very quiet place. If you are new here, welcome. If you have been around before, it is genuinely good to have you back. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It truly does help other people find their way here at whatever hour the night has given them. And drop a comment below with where you are and what the local time is. People arrive at this channel from all kinds of places and all kinds of hours, and there is something quietly reassuring about knowing they are all settling in at the same time, now. Get comfortable. Let your shoulders drop. Slow your breathing down just a little. Tonight we are going back to China to the very last years of the 1800s, to a village surrounded by green hills and rice paddies, to a farmhouse where a boy was growing up between a strict father and a gentle mother, already restless, already paying close attention to things that most children simply accept without question. Shaoshan was a small place. It sat in the hills of Hunan province, in south-central China, about 90 miles from the provincial capital of Changsha. The village was a collection of stone farmhouses, terraced fields, and irrigation channels that had been running through the same valleys for generations. Most families there had farmed the same land for as long as anyone could remember. Life followed the seasons without much argument, planting in spring, harvesting in autumn, managing debts, maintaining the family shrine, keeping things going. Mao Zedong was born there on the 26th of December, 1893. His father, Mao Yichang, had started life poor, deep in debt, working small rented plots of land. But he was sharp with money, patient in the way that ambitious people tend to be patient, and over many years he had reversed his situation entirely. By the time his son arrived, Yichang owned his land outright, operated a small grain trading business that gave him real standing in the local economy, and occasionally employed hired labourers during the busiest parts of the farming calendar. He was demanding at home, precise about finances, and not a man who spent much time on warmth. He kept written records of every transaction. He expected his children to contribute to the household without being asked and without complaint. Mao's mother, Wen Qimei, was different in almost every meaningful way. She was gentle, deeply religious, and generous, the kind of woman who fed monks passing through the village and helped poorer neighbours when she could do so quietly. She practiced Buddhism not as a formal exercise but as something woven into daily life, a way of moving through the world that assumed others deserved consideration. Mao adored her. He would speak of her in later years with a tenderness that almost never appeared when he talked about anything else from his childhood. Between these two very different people, Mao grew up with a divided interior pulling from his father's toughness and his mother's sympathy, not always finding a way to hold both at once. He started at the village school around the age of 8. The curriculum was classical Confucian texts, ancient poems, the moral philosophy that had shaped Chinese education for more than 1,000 years. Mao was capable with it, good enough at memorization to manage the work without much struggle. But what truly held his attention was not the official curriculum. He discovered, on his own, a set of novels that were not on any school reading list. Water Margin, a sprawling story about outlaws who rob corrupt officials and protect ordinary people. Romance of the Three Kingdoms, full of battles and strategy and the collapse of dynasties. These were the books that actually got inside him. His father thought them useless distractions from practical learning. Mao read them in corners and quiet moments whenever he could, hiding them the way other children hide sweets. He also found, at some point in early adolescence, a short pamphlet describing the various foreign humiliations China had suffered in recent decades. He recalled being disturbed by it in a way that went beyond ordinary childhood worry. It was not about him or his family or the village. It was about something bigger, the sense that the country itself had been weakened, that the people in charge had not protected it, and that nobody seemed to be working seriously on the problem. That instinct was not wrong. China in the 1890s was in a difficult condition that had been building for the better part of a century. The Qing Dynasty, founded in the 1640s by the Manchu people from the north, had governed a vast empire for over 200 years, and for much of that time it had managed well enough. But starting in the middle of the 1800s, the pressures had become severe. The Opium Wars with Britain had ended in treaties that forced China to open its ports, pay large indemnities, and grant privileges to foreign nationals on Chinese soil. Then the Taiping Rebellion of the 1850s and 1860s, a massive civil uprising rooted in a strange mixture of Christianity and grievance, had killed somewhere between 20 million and 30 million people before it was suppressed. That catastrophe is almost never discussed in Western history, which says more about Western history than it does about the catastrophe. Then came the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894 and 1895. Japan, a country that had been borrowing and adapting from Chinese civilization for over 1,000 years, defeated the Qing military with an efficiency that shocked everyone, including the Japanese. China lost control of Korea and ceded Taiwan under the peace terms. The dynasty was still standing, but the ground beneath it had shifted badly. In Shaoshan, these events arrived as distant news carried in provincial papers, discussed in market conversations, absorbed as a kind of background unease rather than immediate crisis. The village still ran on grain prices and weather, but the larger story was already shaping the world into which Mao would eventually step. By the time he was 13, the situation at home had worn down to something like a permanent low-level standoff. His father pulled him from school and put him to work full-time hauling grain, recording transactions, helping manage the land. Mao did the work. He also watched carefully. He watched how his father spoke to hired labourers, how money shaped the way people held themselves around each other, how deference was performed by those who had less and expected by those who had more. He did not like what he saw, though he could not yet have explained precisely why. He also pushed back when he could. There is a story, repeated often enough that it likely contains real truth, of a moment when his father moved to humiliate him publicly in front of gathered guests. Mao threatened to walk into the family pond and stay there. His father relented. Mao was perhaps 14 at the time. He filed the lesson away carefully. Around the age of 16, with relatives serving as quiet go-betweens, Mao persuaded his father to let him transfer to a larger school in a nearby county. The negotiation was tense, and the departure was not warm. But Mao left. He walked out of Shaoshan carrying a small pack of belongings, a head full of stories about rebellious heroes, and a very unresolved sense of what he was supposed to do next. He did not know yet what was coming. He did not know about Marxism, or the Long March, or Tiananmen. He was just a farmer's son from a hill village, 17 years old, heading toward Changsha and whatever came after. Shaoshan stayed exactly as he left it. The rice terraces are still there today, carefully preserved, well lit, visited by millions of tourists every year, who arrive by tour bus to see the birthplace of a man who spent much of his life trying to abolish the conditions that produced tour buses. There is a bronze statue, a museum, and a very large car park. Mao himself probably would have had feelings about that. A young man leaves home. The road from Shaoshan to the town of Xiangxiang was not very long by distance. By everything else, education, social expectation, the kind of world a person could imagine living in it was considerable. Mao arrived at Dongshan Higher Primary School in Xiangxiang County in 1909, when he was around 16 years old. This was already unusual. Most of the students enrolled there were younger, drawn from families with some background in formal education and accustomed to the particular social rituals of a school environment. Mao was older, obviously rural, wearing clothes that identified him as a farmer's son rather than a merchant's or a scholar's, and carrying an accent that some of his classmates found easy to mock. He was also, by most accounts, noticeably large, physically bigger than many of the other boys, which probably helped him absorb the social friction without it becoming a problem. What he had that most of his classmates did not was an appetite for reading that bordered on compulsive. He moved through books quickly, remembered what he read, and had already developed strong opinions about things that other students his age had not yet thought about. The novels of his childhood had given him a framework stories about how power worked, how dynasties fell, how determined individuals could change the course of events. Now, at Dongshan, he began to encounter newspapers for the first time. This was not a small thing. Newspapers in China in 1909 were not purely local instruments. They carried translated articles from foreign papers, reports of political movements in Japan and Europe, accounts of nationalist uprisings in other colonized nations. They carried the writings of Liang Qichao, one of the most influential Chinese intellectuals of the era, who argued in precise and urgent prose that China needed to fundamentally reform itself, not just its government, but the habits of mind that had allowed the country to fall behind. Mao read Liang Qichao carefully. He would later say that he had been powerfully influenced by him. The idea that a nation's condition was not simply a matter of fate, but of choices made and unmade by actual human beings that landed somewhere deep. He also read, during this period, accounts of a man named Sun Yat-sen, who had been working for years from abroad to organize a revolution that would end the Qing Dynasty entirely and establish a modern republic in its place. Sun Yat-sen had already led or inspired several failed uprisings by the time Mao encountered his name in print. The failures had not slowed him down, which was itself an interesting thing to absorb at 16. After roughly a year at Dongshan, Mao managed to move to Changsha, the provincial capital of Hunan, and the largest city he had yet encountered. He enrolled in a secondary school there in the spring of 1911. Changsha had about 300,000 people at that point, markets that went on for blocks, printing houses producing pamphlets and journals that argued about China's future from a dozen different angles, and a general atmosphere of educated restlessness that Mao found enormously stimulating. He walked its streets with the alertness of a person who has been somewhere smaller for too long and is now taking everything in at once. He would not have much time to settle in before the country lurched forward in a way that nobody had quite managed to predict. On the 10th of October, 1911, a date the Chinese would come to call the Double Tenth, a military uprising in the city of Wuchang, several hundred miles north of Changsha, set off a chain reaction that swept across multiple provinces within weeks. Soldiers, students, reformers, and local power brokers who had been waiting for exactly this kind of opening declared their provinces independent of the Qing government in rapid succession. The dynasty, which had survived foreign wars, massive rebellions, and a century of steady humiliation, proved unable to hold against this. In Changsha, the mood in the streets shifted almost overnight from wary tension to something approaching euphoria. Mao enlisted in the local revolutionary army. He was 17 years old. He spent approximately 6 months as a soldier, which mostly involved carrying water for the unit and listening to the older men argue about politics. The actual fighting in Hunan was limited. The real transformation was happening at a different level in newspapers, in assembly halls, in the declarations being signed in provincial capitals where men in Western suits were writing constitutions and founding institutions they had, in many cases, never actually seen in operation. In February of 1912, the last Qing emperor, a boy of 6 years old named Puyi, formally abdicated. The dynasty that had governed China since the 1640s was gone. Sun Yat-sen, who had been in the United States fundraising when the uprising began and had rushed back to take political leadership of the movement, was briefly declared provisional president of the new Republic of China. It was, on paper, a genuine revolution. The complications arrived almost immediately. Sun Yat-sen lacked the military power to hold the republic together, and within months he had negotiated a deal with Yuan Shikai, a former Qing military commander with real troops and real institutional support, who became president in his place. Yuan Shikai was not particularly interested in republican ideals. The revolution had toppled the dynasty without yet building anything solid enough to fill the space it left. Mao recognized this. He left the army after the abdication, returned to Changsha, and spent the better part of the following year in a somewhat uncertain drift through several schools, trying to figure out what kind of education would actually be useful in the world that seemed to be emerging. He tried a police training school. He tried a law school. He tried a commercial school. None of them held him for long. What did hold him was the reading room of the Hunan Provincial Library, where he spent months going through maps, history books, translated works on economics and political philosophy, and anything else he could get his hands on. He read Adam Smith. He read Darwin. He read accounts of the French Revolution, the American Revolution, and the various nationalist movements that had reshaped Europe in the 1800s. He later said this was one of the most formative periods of his intellectual life, not structured learning, but wide, self-directed reading across an enormous range of subjects, building a picture of the world that no single school curriculum could have given him. He was also beginning to form, quietly, a set of questions that he would carry for years before he found anything like an answer to them. China had just ended an imperial system that had lasted over 2,000 years. The republic that replaced it was already shaky. The foreign powers that had been extracting concessions and humiliating the country for decades had not stopped doing so simply because the government had changed. What did it actually take to rebuild a country? Who should lead that process? Where did real power come from, and how was it held? In 1913, he enrolled at the Hunan First Normal School, a teacher training college in Changsha, and stayed for 5 years. It was the longest he had remained anywhere since Shaoshan. The school gave him structure, peers who matched his intellectual energy, and a series of teachers who pushed him in directions he had not yet explored. One of them, a professor of ethics named Yang Changji, would become one of the most important mentors of Mao's early life. Yang had studied in Japan, Scotland, and Germany. He believed deeply in the development of character alongside the development of intellect, and he saw in Mao something worth cultivating. Mao, for his part, threw himself into the school's activities with characteristic intensity. He organized a student political discussion group. He exercised obsessively, swimming in cold rivers, hiking in the hills, convinced that a strong body was a necessary foundation for any serious intellectual or political work. He began writing essays on Chinese history and politics that his teachers found impressive and occasionally alarming in their confidence. He had opinions, and he was not shy about them. Changsha in these years was a city alive with argument. The collapse of the Qing had released decades of suppressed debate about what China was and what it needed to become. Reformers, revolutionaries, traditionalists, and confused young men who were all three things at once filled the tea houses and newspaper offices and school halls. It was the kind of atmosphere that accelerates certain kinds of people. Mao was, clearly, one of those kinds of people. The rice fields of Shaoshan had given him a body built for hard conditions and a mind that had learned to watch power carefully. Changsha was now giving him language, the vocabulary of politics, history, and reform to put around what he already instinctively knew. He was not yet 20 years old. The ideas that would eventually reshape a civilization were still years away. But the raw material was assembling itself, quietly, in a teacher training college in a provincial city, in the person of a large, opinionated young man from Hunan, who had never yet been outside his own province. Beijing, books, and a new world. Mao graduated from the Hunan First Normal School in the summer of 1918 at the age of 24. He had spent 5 years there, longer than he had stayed anywhere since childhood, and he left with a teaching certificate, a set of deeply held political opinions that were still in the process of finding their full shape, and a connection to his mentor Yang Changji that would prove almost immediately useful. Yang Changji had accepted a professorship at Peking University and moved to Beijing the year before. Peking University, known in China as Beida, a compression of its full name, was not simply the country's most prestigious academic institution. In 1918, it was also the intellectual center of a China in urgent, sometimes furious conversation with itself about what it needed to become. The university's chancellor, Cai Yuanpei, had made a deliberate policy of hiring faculty with radically different worldviews and letting them argue in front of students. Marxists sat alongside liberals. Anarchists occupied offices down the hall from Confucian scholars. The campus operated on the unusual assumption that the collision of ideas was itself a productive thing. Mao arrived in Beijing in the autumn of 1918, accompanying a group of Hunanese students who were organizing a work-study program to travel to France. France, in the aftermath of the First World War, needed labor for reconstruction and was willing to accept Chinese students who would work while studying. Many of Mao's friends, including several who would later become important communist figures, joined the program. Mao chose not to. He said, at the time, that he did not yet know enough about his own country to go studying abroad. Whether this was genuine conviction or something more practical is hard to say. Either way, he stayed. Yang Changji arranged for him to take a position as an assistant in the university library, working under the chief librarian, a man named Li Dazhao. Li Dazhao was 30 years old at the time, only a few years older than Mao, and already one of the most important intellectual figures in China. He had studied in Japan, read extensively in Western political philosophy, and arrived at a version of Marxism that he was actively adapting to Chinese conditions. He was warm, approachable, and genuinely curious about ideas from outside his own framework. In the summer of 1918, he published 2 essays in the journal New Youth, a widely read progressive magazine edited by the scholar Chen Duxiu, in which he argued that the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia the previous year was not merely a political event but the opening movement of a global transformation. Li Dazhao was not simply commenting on what had happened in Russia. He was building a case for why it was relevant to China. Mao's job involved registering visitors, organizing newspapers and periodicals, and keeping track of who was checking out what. It paid 8 yuan a month, which was not very much even by the standards of the day. He lived in a rented room with several other Hunanese students, all of them crowded into a space they described, without much exaggeration, as barely large enough to turn around in. Beijing winters are harsh, and their quarters were not well heated. The job, though modest, put him inside one of the most active intellectual environments in the country. He attended lectures when he could in ethics, philosophy, economics, and politics, though he was not enrolled as a student and was treated accordingly. He later recalled with some bitterness that professors who became famous in later years would not answer his questions after lectures because he was just a library worker from Hunan, not a proper student. The academic world, he noted, had its own version of the social hierarchies he had been irritated by since childhood. What the library gave him, directly, was Li Dazhao. Conversations with Li Dazhao introduced Mao to Marxism not as an abstract system but as a live analytical tool, a way of explaining why some people owned land and others worked it, why some nations accumulated power while others lost it, and what the historical forces were that pushed societies through phases of change. Mao was not immediately converted. He was reading widely across multiple frameworks at this point: anarchism, liberalism, the writings of various Chinese reformers, and had not yet settled on any single explanatory system. But the encounter with Li Dazhao left a mark. The idea that history moved according to structural forces, not simply the decisions of emperors and generals, fit something he had been circling around since his reading room years in Changsha. He also, during this Beijing period, fell in love. Yang Changji's daughter, Yang Kaihui, was a student in her own right, thoughtful, educated, and politically aware in ways that matched Mao's own developing sensibilities. The relationship was quiet and did not fully develop until later, but it began here, in the overlapping social world of her father's household and the university campus. By early 1919, Mao returned to Changsha, partly to help organize work-study activities and partly because his mother had fallen ill. He took a teaching position at a primary school and began editing a student political journal. He was 25, back in the province he knew, but carrying back from Beijing a set of ideas and contacts that gave everything around him a different weight. Then the 4th of May arrived. The immediate cause of the May 4th movement was the Treaty of Versailles. China had contributed labor battalions to the Allied war effort during the First World War, over 100,000 men sent to France and Mesopotamia for non-combat work. The expectation, widely held and loudly expressed by the Chinese government at the peace conference, was that this contribution would be rewarded with the return of Shandong province, which had been under German control since the 1890s. Instead, the Allied powers handed Shandong's concessions directly to Japan, which had extracted secret agreements on the subject during the war. The Chinese delegation refused to sign the treaty. The news reached Beijing on the 3rd of May, 1919. The following day, 3,000 students gathered at Tiananmen Gate, the very spot where, 30 years later, Mao would make a very different kind of announcement and march through the city. They attacked the homes of ministers they blamed for the capitulation. They called for a national boycott of Japanese goods. The protests spread rapidly to other cities. Merchants shut their shops in solidarity. Workers in Shanghai went on strike. For several weeks, the country experienced something that looked like a genuine popular movement, cutting across class lines, held together by shared anger at a foreign policy establishment that had failed the country once again. The May 4th movement meant different things to different people. To some, it was fundamentally a patriotic uprising against foreign domination. To others, particularly the intellectuals gathered around the journal New Youth, it was the opening of a much deeper project, a complete reassessment of Chinese culture, tradition, and thought. Chen Duxiu, the magazine's editor, had been arguing for years that China's real problem was not simply bad government or foreign interference, but the weight of Confucian tradition, the deference to hierarchy, the suppression of individual thinking, the preference for order over inquiry that had, in his view, made the country intellectually incapable of modernizing itself. The New Culture movement, as this argument came to be called for science and democracy as the twin foundations of a rebuilt China. It was radical, exciting, and to many educated young people in their 20s, enormously persuasive. Mao was in Changsha during May and June of 1919, editing his student journal and writing with increasing urgency about what he was watching happen. He published articles calling on Hunan students to organize, to resist, to take the political situation seriously. The journal did not last long. The provincial authorities shut it down, but the act of producing it clarified something for him. Writing about politics was not the same as doing politics. He wanted to do. He returned briefly to Beijing in early 1920, partly to check on the French work-study students who had departed, and partly to follow up on political contacts he had made through Li Dazhao's circle. By this point, Li Dazhao was actively corresponding with others across China about the possibility of organizing a formal Marxist political party. The Russian Revolution, now several years old, was generating real institutional infrastructure. The Communist International, known as the Comintern, was reaching out to revolutionary movements in Asia, offering organizational guidance and modest financial support. Mao then traveled to Shanghai, where he had a significant meeting with Chen Duxiu, the New Youth editor, who had, by 1920, moved firmly toward Marxism as the framework for China's transformation. Chen was direct, intellectually rigorous, and had arrived at his political conclusions through a different route than Li Dazhao, but both men were now pointing in the same direction. Mao was not yet a committed communist at this point, but he was close. The conversations in Shanghai removed most of the remaining distance. He returned to Changsha in the summer of 1920 and set up a small bookstore that sold progressive literature, organized a study group focused on Marxist texts, and waited for what he could sense was coming a moment when the question of how to save China would require more than books and arguments. He had been the library worker that professors ignored. He had been the farm boy that students at Dongshan had looked down on. He had stood at the edges of more rooms than he could count, listening, reading, watching how things worked. The party is born. In the summer of 1921, delegates from Marxist study groups across China quietly made their way to Shanghai. They travelled separately by different routes, which was partly practical caution and partly the habit of people who were not yet entirely sure what they were building but understood that the authorities would not approve of it. There were 13 of them in total, representing a combined national membership of somewhere around 57 people. As founding moments of world historical movements go, it was not, on the surface, a particularly impressive gathering. The First National Congress of the Chinese Communist Party convened on the 23rd of July, 1921, in a girls' school in the French concession of Shanghai, which had been borrowed for the occasion while the students were on summer holiday. The French concession was one of the foreign-administered zones carved out of Shanghai under the unequal treaties, a stretch of streets that technically operated under French law, which the organizers calculated would give them more insulation from the Chinese police. This was reasonable thinking that turned out to be only partially correct. On the evening of the 30th of July, a suspicious figure appeared at the meeting place and looked around before leaving quickly. The delegates evacuated within minutes. A French police agent arrived shortly afterward, found the room empty, and searched it without result. The Congress finished its work on a boat on the South Lake near the city of Jiaxing, approximately 90 miles from Shanghai, drifting quietly on the water while the delegates completed their resolutions. It was an unusual setting for the founding of a political party that would eventually govern the most populous nation on earth. But circumstances had not offered better options. Mao was one of the 13 delegates, representing the Hunan branch of the movement. He was 27 years old, and by most accounts, not among the most prominent voices at the Congress. That distinction belonged to others with more theoretical training and stronger Moscow connections. But he was there, and he voted. And he went back to Changsha as the party's provincial secretary for Hunan, which meant he was now responsible for building the communist movement across an entire province, largely on his own initiative. He proved good at it. His most sustained effort during these early years was in the coalfields and mills of Hunan, where workers lived and worked in conditions that required very little ideological preparation to find objectionable. The Anyuan coal mines, in particular, became one of the most successful examples of early communist labor organizing in China. Mao worked alongside a colleague named Liu Shaoqi, a name to remember, to build a union at Anyuan that eventually won real concessions from the mine management through a strike in 1922. The workers held out, the management conceded, and for a brief period the Communist Party had a concrete, visible success it could point to. Mao also organized in the textile factories, among railroad workers, and in the countryside, where he was beginning to develop an interest in the peasantry that ran against the grain of standard Marxist theory. The Soviet model, which the Comintern promoted and most Chinese communists accepted, held that the industrial working class, the urban proletariat, was the natural vanguard of any genuine revolution. But China in the 1920s had a relatively small industrial working class and an enormous peasantry. Hundreds of millions of farming families, many of them deeply poor and increasingly restless under the pressure of landlords, warlord taxation, and a government that seemed to exist mainly to extract from them. Mao kept noticing this. He was not yet prepared to make a formal theoretical argument about it, but the observation was accumulating. In January of 1923, the political landscape shifted significantly. Under pressure from the Soviet Union's Comintern, which held the view that China was not yet ready for a full socialist revolution and needed first to complete a bourgeois nationalist one, the Chinese Communist Party entered into a formal alliance with Sun Yat-sen's nationalist party, the Kuomintang. The arrangement was unusual by Leninist standards. Communists were allowed to join the Kuomintang as individuals while retaining their CCP membership, operating as a party within a party. Sun Yat-sen accepted Soviet organizational and financial assistance in exchange for the alliance, and began restructuring the Kuomintang along more disciplined Leninist lines with the help of Soviet advisors. The First United Front, as it was called, created a strange double life for men like Mao. He worked within Kuomintang institutions, at one point running its propaganda department in Canton, while simultaneously maintaining his Communist Party work. The two organizations shared goals in the short term: ending the rule of the warlords who had divided China among themselves since the collapse of Yuan Shikai's government, and reducing foreign imperial power. They disagreed, quietly and with growing intensity, about what came after. Sun Yat-sen died of liver cancer in Beijing in March of 1925, before the United Front's military plans could fully materialize. He was 58 years old. His death left a succession struggle inside the Kuomintang that would take the better part of 2 years to resolve, during which time various figures competed for the nationalist movement's future direction. That same year, on the 30th of May in Shanghai, British-commanded police in the international settlement opened fire on a crowd of Chinese demonstrators protesting the arrest of union organizers. Several people were killed. The incident ignited anti-imperialist protests across the country that lasted for months, energizing both the nationalist and communist movements simultaneously. Strikes shut down foreign-owned businesses. Boycotts targeted British goods. For a period, the general momentum of Chinese nationalist politics seemed unstoppable. Mao spent much of 1925 and 1926 moving between Shanghai, Canton, and Hunan, doing party work in various forms. He was not yet a dominant figure in the Communist Party's national leadership. The men above him had stronger theoretical credentials and closer ties to Moscow, but he was building a reputation as someone who understood the countryside in a way that most urban-educated party leaders did not. He crystallized this understanding in early 1927, when he traveled through Hunan province conducting a direct investigation of the peasant movement that had been gathering force in the rural counties. He visited 5 counties over 32 days, talking to farmers, local activists, and rural party members, watching the peasant associations that had formed in the previous year assert increasingly radical control over local affairs, seizing landlords' grain stores, tearing up debt records, sometimes physically parading landlords through the streets in dunce caps. It was disorganized, sometimes violent, and entirely outside the formal party structure. Mao wrote a report about what he had seen that was one of the more remarkable political documents of his early career. He argued that the peasant movement was not a problem to be managed or restrained, but a force of nature. His exact phrase was something like a tornado that could not be stopped, and that the Communist Party needed to place itself at the front of it, rather than trying to moderate it for the sake of the United Front with the Kuomintang. The peasantry, he suggested, was the true revolutionary class in China, not the small urban proletariat. The Comintern and most of the CCP leadership disagreed. The Soviet model said workers led revolutions. Mao was suggesting that for China, history might have other plans. The report was published, debated, and largely set aside by the party leadership in favor of maintaining the alliance with the Kuomintang. Meanwhile, the northern expedition, the the Kuomintang's military campaign to unify China by marching north and crushing the warlords had begun in the summer of 1926 under the command of a general named Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang had emerged from the post-Sun Yat-sen succession as the dominant military figure in the nationalist movement, taking control of the party's military academy at Whampoa and building a base of loyalty among officers who owed their careers to him personally. He was efficient, cold-eyed, and increasingly uncomfortable with the communist presence inside his party. The northern expedition moved faster than almost anyone had expected. Kuomintang armies swept through central and southeastern China in months, the warlords crumbling in sequence. Workers in Shanghai launched a general strike in support of the advancing army, seizing control of much of the city before nationalist troops arrived. The revolution seemed to be accelerating. Chiang Kai-shek arrived in Shanghai in late March of 1927. He spent several weeks in the city, meeting with businessmen, foreign bankers, and organized crime figures who had their own reasons to want the communist labor movement reduced. He was, by this point, making calculations that the Communist Party leadership in Moscow and most CCP leaders either did not see coming or chose not to believe. The alliance had always been built on the assumption that both sides needed each other. That assumption was about to be tested with great violence, blood in the streets. In the early hours of the 12th of April, 1927, armed men moved through the streets of Shanghai's Chinese districts in coordinated groups. They were not nationalist soldiers in uniform. They were members of the Green Gang, one of the most powerful criminal organizations in China, with roots in the city's waterfront labor rackets and a long history of doing useful work for people with money and authority. Chiang Kai-shek had spent weeks arranging this. The targets were communist labor organizers, union leaders, and party members who had helped deliver Shanghai to the nationalist cause just weeks earlier. The killing began before dawn and continued through the day. Workers who came out to resist were shot. Union halls were surrounded and emptied at gunpoint. Anyone found with communist literature or connections was taken away, and most of them did not come back. By the end of April, the communist-led trade union movement in Shanghai had been effectively destroyed. The death toll was in the hundreds in Shanghai alone, and the violence spread rapidly to other cities under nationalist control: Guangzhou, Nanjing, Hangzhou, where local commanders carried out their own versions of the purge with varying degrees of thoroughness. The Chinese Communist Party lost somewhere between 10,000 and 25,000 members in the weeks and months that followed. The exact number has never been established with certainty. Many were executed. Many more went underground. Others simply stopped being communists and hoped nobody was keeping a list. The Wuhan government, a left-leaning faction of the Kuomintang that had broken with Chiang and was still nominally allied with the communists, briefly seemed like it might hold out as an alternative power center. It did not. By July of 1927, Wuhan had also purged its communist members, and the United Front was completely finished. The party that had counted 57 members in that borrowed schoolroom in Shanghai 6 years earlier had, through the purge, been reduced to a hunted organization with no territory, no reliable army, and a leadership that disagreed bitterly about what had just happened and whose fault it was. The Comintern in Moscow blamed the CCP leadership for not being aggressive enough. The CCP leadership blamed each other. Mao, who had been warning for months that the party was underestimating the tension building inside the alliance, was in no particular position to say he had told them so, because he was busy trying to survive. The party ordered several uprisings in the summer and autumn of 1927, calculated to demonstrate that the communist movement had not been broken. The most significant of these, and the one with the longest consequences for Chinese history, was the Nanchang Uprising on the 1st of August, led by Zhou Enlai and a military commander named Zhu De. The Nanchang rebels held the city for a few days before being driven out by nationalist forces, then retreated south in disarray. The date of the Nanchang Uprising, the 1st of August, 1927, is still celebrated as the founding date of what eventually became the People's Liberation Army, which tells you something about how founding myths work. The uprising itself was, militarily, a failure. Mao's assignment was the autumn harvest uprising in Hunan, scheduled for September. The plan, drawn up by the party's central leadership, called for an insurrection across multiple counties, timed to coincide with the harvest season when peasant grievances were typically sharpest. Mao assembled a force of several thousand men, a mix of miners, peasant militias, and former soldiers, and launched the uprising in early September. It collapsed within days. The forces were poorly armed, poorly coordinated, and met by nationalist troops who were far better organized than the plan had assumed. One of Mao's columns was routed almost immediately. Another disintegrated when its commander was captured. By the time Mao pulled together what remained roughly 1,000 men, demoralized and depleted, it was clear that marching on Changsha, the original objective, was not a serious option. Here Mao made a decision that the party's central leadership explicitly rejected, and that would define everything that followed. Instead of pressing the attack as ordered, or disbanding and going underground, he led his remaining force southeast into the Jinggang Mountains, a rugged, densely forested range straddling the border between Hunan and Jiangxi provinces, largely outside the effective control of either provincial government. It was the kind of territory that tended to attract people with reasons to be elsewhere, which was more or less exactly where Mao and his 1,000 men now found themselves. The Jinggang Mountains were cold, heavily forested, and supplied by a road network that could charitably be described as theoretical. Local farmers grew enough to survive, and not much else. As locations to begin rebuilding a revolutionary movement went, it ranked somewhere between difficult and genuinely miserable. Two local bandit chiefs, Wang Zuo and Yuan Wensheng, already controlled parts of the mountain territory with their own armed bands. Mao negotiated with them, incorporated their forces into his own, and established a rough base in the town of Saiping. He was operating now entirely outside the party's central command structure, making decisions as the situation required them rather than as Moscow or Shanghai directed. This was either independent thinking or insubordination, depending on who was doing the describing. What he built in the Jinggang Mountains over the following months was small, fragile, and frequently on the verge of collapse from food shortages, disease, and nationalist encirclement campaigns. But it was also the first functioning red base area in China, a territory where Communist Party authority, however thin, was the operating reality. Mao introduced land redistribution policies within the base, taking land from landlords and distributing it to poor farmers, which built genuine local loyalty. He established a military discipline code that, by the standards of Chinese armies at the time, which were often indistinguishable from organized banditry, was notably strict. The Red Army, as the force was beginning to be called, was forbidden from looting civilians, was required to pay for what it took, and was expected to treat prisoners decently. These were not purely moral positions, they were tactical ones. Mao had concluded, from watching the peasant movement in Hunan, and from the lessons of the autumn uprising's failure, that no revolutionary force could survive in the countryside without the active support of the population it moved through. An army that stole from farmers made enemies. An army that paid and treated people respectfully made a supply network. In April of 1928, Zhu Dai arrived at Jinganshan with the remnants of the Nanchang uprising forces, several thousand men, veterans of actual combat and far better armed than Mao's current force. The two men merged their armies into what became known as the Fourth Red Army, with Zhu Dai as military commander and Mao as political commissar. It was a partnership that would last for decades and become one of the more effective command relationships in 20th century military history. Zhu Dai was steady, technically capable, and trusted by soldiers. Mao supplied strategic thinking and political direction. They disagreed sometimes, but they worked. From these months in the mountains, Mao began developing and articulating the tactical principles that would eventually be known as Maoist guerrilla warfare. The core ideas were straightforward in statement and extraordinarily difficult in practice. Avoid fixed positions, refuse to engage superior forces in direct battle, move constantly, build political relationships with the local population, strike only where and when the advantage is clear, then disappear before the enemy can respond. He compressed the essentials into a simple formula: enemy advances, we retreat. Enemy halts, we harass. Enemy exhausts, we attack. Enemy retreats, we pursue. Easy to memorize. Genuinely hard to execute for months on end in the mountains without adequate food, medicine, or weapons. The Central Party leadership, operating from Shanghai with considerable Soviet guidance, was not pleased with the Jinganshan experiment. The official view was that rural base areas were a distraction from the correct strategy of building urban worker movements and waiting for a genuine revolutionary crisis in the cities. Mao received critical communications, was removed from party positions, and at one point was formally disciplined. He largely ignored the disciplinary proceedings and kept doing what he thought was necessary. Yang Kaihui, his wife, remained in Changsha with their 3 young sons. Mao had left her behind when he retreated to the mountains, and the separation was indefinite. The nationalist authorities knew who she was. The risk she faced was real and increasing. Mao was aware of this and unable to do anything about it from where he was. The mountains held, barely and at considerable cost, but they held. The nationalist encirclement campaigns came and were survived. The food shortages were endured. The political arguments within the force were managed. The small base area expanded slowly into the surrounding counties. Something was being built. It was not yet clear what, exactly, but it was being built. The long march begins. By 1931, the communists had moved out of the Jinggang Mountains and established a more substantial base area in Jiangxi province, centered on the town of Rujin in the province's southeastern corner. They called it the Central Soviet, a patch of rural China roughly the size of a small European country, with its own government, tax system, land redistribution program, and an army that had grown considerably from the 1,000 exhausted men who had climbed into the mountains 4 years earlier. The Jiangxi Soviet period was productive in some ways and deeply troubled in others. The Red Army repelled 4 successive nationalist encirclement campaigns between 1930 and 1933, each one larger and better organized than the last. The tactics that worked were the guerrilla methods Mao had developed: fluid, mobile, avoiding pitched battles, exploiting the army's knowledge of the local terrain against a larger force that could not be everywhere at once. Chiang Kai-shek threw more troops at each campaign, tightened the blockade, and watched the previous results repeat. The base area held. What did not hold was Mao's position within the party. The Communist Party's central leadership had, by the early 1930s, come under the influence of a group known informally as the 28 Bolsheviks Chinese Communists, who had studied in Moscow, spoke Russian, and carried the authority of Soviet backing. Their dominant figures were Wang Ming and Bo Gu, and they arrived back in China with strong views about correct Marxist-Leninist doctrine and limited patience for Mao's tactical improvisations. A German military advisor sent by the Comintern Otto Braun, who went by the Chinese name Li Di, provided professional military guidance that leaned heavily toward conventional positional warfare. Mao was progressively sidelined. He lost his formal military command role. His proposals were rejected at party meetings. For a period in 1933 and 1934, he was essentially a political figure without operational authority, watching from the margin while the party's new leadership made decisions he believed were wrong. He had more personal reasons for grief during this period. In November of 1930, nationalist authorities in Changsha had arrested Yang Kaihui, his wife, who had remained in the city with their 3 sons while Mao was in the mountains. She was held, interrogated, and offered her freedom if she would publicly denounce her husband and the Communist Party. She refused. She was executed on the 14th of November, 1930. She was 29 years old. Mao did not learn of her death for some time. When he did, the record suggests he was genuinely devastated, a response that sat awkwardly alongside the fact that he had already, by 1928, formed a relationship with a young woman named He Zizhen, who had joined the Jinganshan base and became his companion for the years that followed. These overlapping arrangements were not unusual for leading men in revolutionary movements, and the party did not make much of it. But Yang Kaihui's death was a loss of a specific kind that could not be rationalized into anything cleaner than it was. The fifth and final nationalist encirclement campaign, launched in the autumn of 1933, was different from the previous four. Chiang Kai-shek had learned from his failures. He hired German military advisors, constructed a methodical system of blockhouses and roads that allowed him to advance slowly and consolidate each gain before moving further, and deployed nearly 1 million troops in a coordinated compression of the Soviet base. The Red Army, now under Braun and Bogu's direction, fought back with positional tactics defending fixed lines, giving battle where the enemy was strongest. It was the approach Mao had argued against, and it failed in precisely the ways he had predicted. By the summer of 1934, the Jiangxi Soviet was being squeezed into a shrinking perimeter. Food was running short. Casualty rates were unsustainable. The leadership that had sidelined Mao spent several months preparing a breakout in secret, and on the night of the 15th of October, 1934, the Red Army crossed the nationalist blockade lines and began what would become known as the Long March. Approximately 86,000 people moved out that night: soldiers, party officials, and a small number of women, including He Zizhen, who was pregnant. They carried weapons, equipment, printing presses, and enough bureaucratic material to suggest the leadership had not entirely let go of the idea that the entire Soviet apparatus could be relocated intact. Moving that volume of material through unfamiliar territory, with nationalist forces closing behind, turned what might have been a rapid escape into a slow-moving column that was visible from considerable distance. The first major catastrophe came at the Xiang River in Guangxi province in late November of 1934. The Red Army needed to cross the river, and crossing took far longer than planned because of the volume of equipment and the pace of the column. Nationalist air and ground forces found the crossing point and attacked for 5 days while the army was stretched across the river and unable to maneuver. The Red Army lost approximately 30,000 men at the Xiang River, killed, wounded, or scattered, reducing the force to somewhere around 30,000 survivors. The central leadership had been moving the army in a direction that was already costing it at a rate it could not sustain. The Zunyi Conference, held in January of 1935 in the city of Zunyi in Guizhou province, was the moment things changed. It was an emergency meeting of the party's senior leadership, called because the losses at the Xiang River and the general failures of the encirclement defense had made the existing command arrangement impossible to defend. Over several days of argument, Mao pressed his critique of Braun and Bogu's military leadership with the support of several key allies, including Zhou Enlai, who shifted his position in Mao's favor at a critical moment. The outcome was not a complete transfer of power. The party's internal politics were more layered than that, but it was a decisive shift. Otto Braun was effectively removed from military authority. Mao was elevated to a new standing committee position and given real influence over military decisions. It was the first time in years that he held genuine command authority, and he moved quickly to change how the march was being conducted. What followed the Zunyi Conference was still an ordeal by any measure, but it was a differently managed one. Instead of marching toward a fixed destination while nationalist forces converged, the Red Army began moving fluidly, doubling back, crossing the same rivers multiple times, keeping nationalist commanders uncertain about where it was going. Chiang Kai-shek's forces, expecting a broken army retreating in a straight line, could not quite get ahead of it. The march went north and west through some of the most physically demanding terrain in China. The army crossed the deep gorges of Yunnan province, where the Jinsha River runs at the bottom of canyons several thousand feet deep. They took the chain suspension bridge at Luding the Luding Bridge, crossing the Dadu River on chains, while nationalist defenders at the far end attempted to hold the position. The crossing became one of the Long March's foundational stories, and was celebrated for decades afterward in Chinese communist history, with an enthusiasm somewhat in excess of the available military records. They crossed the Great Snow Mountains, the high Tibetan Plateau passes where the altitude killed men who had survived battles, and where the cold at the summits was of a kind that soldiers from Hunan had not been designed for. Zijen had given birth to a child during the march, a baby they were unable to keep with them. She was left with a peasant family along the route. Zijen never found the child again. They crossed the grasslands, the vast marshy plateau of Sichuan where the ground gave way underfoot, where there was no wood for fires, and where men who stepped off the narrow paths drowned in the mud before anyone could reach them. The grasslands crossing took about a week, and cost lives at a rate that battle rarely matched. By October of 1935, the survivors reached the Shaanxi Soviet in northern China, an existing but small communist base area that became the destination largely because it was where they ended up, rather than where they had originally been heading. Of the 86,000 who had left Jiangxi, fewer than 8,000 reached Shaanxi. Some accounts say fewer still. The Long March covered approximately 6,000 miles over the course of roughly a year. That calculation, it should be noted, was partly the result of counting the various backtracking and river crossings multiple times, which inflated the total somewhat. But the difficulty was not exaggerated. A force that size, losing that many people over that much distance in those conditions, was a genuine test of physical and organizational endurance. What arrived in Shaanxi was a smaller, harder, and considerably more unified force than the one that had left Jiangxi. The men who survived the Long March shared something that could not be taught or explained to anyone who had not been there. Mao had walked almost every step of it. He was 41 years old, and for the first time in his life, he was unambiguously in charge. Yan'an and the making of a leader. Yan'an was not a place that suggested power. It was a small, dusty town in northern Shaanxi province, sitting in a landscape of yellow loess hills, the kind of soft, compressed soil that the wind had spent thousands of years shaping into ridges and gullies. The Wei River ran nearby. Millet grew on the terraced hillsides. The town itself had a modest market, a few temples, and not much else. What it had in abundance was cave dwellings rooms carved directly into the soft cliff faces, cool in summer and insulated in winter, and requiring no construction materials beyond the labour of digging. The Red Army arrived here in late 1935 and stayed for over a decade. Yan'an became the capital of a communist base area that expanded slowly as the political circumstances of China shifted around it, and the cave dwellings carved into the hills around the town became offices, classrooms, hospitals, printing houses, and homes. Mao's own residence was a set of connected caves on Yangjiling Hill, simple by any objective standard, though somewhat more spacious than the ordinary soldiers' quarters down the slope. Daily life in the Yan'an base area had a texture that visitors from the outside world, and several did come, including the American journalist Edgar Snow, who arrived in 1936 and spent months interviewing Mao and other leaders, found simultaneously austere and strangely energetic. The simplicity was not entirely a matter of poverty, though poverty was real. It was also a deliberate political aesthetic, a way of demonstrating that the Communist Party lived differently from the Kuomintang officials in their Shanghai offices and nationalist officers in their Nanjing clubs. It is worth pausing here on what Chinese society actually looked like in these years, because the contrast between different worlds was sharp enough to matter to the story. In Yan'an and the communist base areas, almost everyone wore the same padded grey or blue cotton uniform: soldiers, students, party officials, and local farmers who had joined the cause. The fabric was rough. Footwear was typically straw sandals or cloth shoes. Meals centered on millet, a grain that grows reliably in the dry northern soil, supplemented by wild vegetables, occasionally salted pork, and whatever could be produced in the small plots that soldiers were required to cultivate as part of a self-sufficiency campaign. There were no private restaurants. Rations were distributed by rank, but the gaps between ranks were deliberately narrow. A senior party official ate better than a private soldier, but not so much better that anyone thought it was worth mentioning. In the nationalist-controlled cities of the East Shanghai, Chongqing, Chengdu, the distance between social classes ran in the opposite direction. Shanghai's wealthy residents moved through a world of tailored qipao dresses for women and Western suits for men, French and American imported goods in department stores on Nanjing Road, and restaurants serving Cantonese and Shanghainese cuisine at prices that a factory worker could not cover with a week's wages. The urban poor in those same cities wore coarse blue or black cotton, ate rice and pickled vegetables when they could afford it, and lived in neighborhoods where several families shared a single room. Rural farmers, who made up the vast majority of China's population, lived on whatever the harvest provided, wore homespun cloth, and had almost no contact with the commercial life of the cities. The gap between Shanghai's Bund and a Sichuan farming village in 1938 was not just economic, it was a gap in realities. Mao understood this gap, had grown up adjacent to it, and built his entire political philosophy around it. The Yan'an period gave him time and relative stability to put his thinking into more formal shape. He wrote prolifically essays on philosophy, on military strategy, on the theory of knowledge, and how it applied to revolutionary practice, and on contradiction. Both written in 1937, attempted to translate Marxist dialectical materialism into a framework that was specifically relevant to Chinese conditions. He was not an original philosopher in the technical sense, and scholars have debated for decades how much of his theoretical framework was genuinely his own and how much was reworked from Soviet sources. But the writing was clear, accessible, and practical in its orientation, which made it useful for training party cadres who needed something concrete to apply. He also wrote On Protracted War in 1938, his most systematic statement of military strategy, which argued that China could not defeat Japan quickly, but could outlast it through a long struggle that exhausted the occupying force's capacity to sustain an overseas campaign. The argument turned out to be correct, though not in the way Mao imagined. It was ultimately American military pressure in the Pacific that broke Japan, not communist guerrilla resistance. Still, the framework held. The Second Sino-Japanese War had begun in July of 1937, with a skirmish at the Marco Polo Bridge outside Beijing, a minor incident that escalated rapidly because both sides were by then looking for a reason to fight. Japanese forces moved swiftly across northern and eastern China, taking Beijing, Shanghai, and then Nanjing, the nationalist capital, in quick succession. In Nanjing, Japanese troops carried out a sustained atrocity against the civilian population over the winter of 1937 and 1938, killing somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 people. The numbers are still disputed. The scale is not. Chiang Kai-shek moved his government further inland to Chongqing in Sichuan province and prepared for a long defense. The communists, who had formed a second united front with the nationalists following the Xi'an incident of December 1936, in which Chiang had been kidnapped by two of his own generals who wanted him to stop fighting. Communists and Focus on Japan technically operated as part of the national resistance. In practice, the two parties competed as much as they cooperated, and the communists used the war years to expand their base areas and build their army, while the nationalists bore most of the direct military burden against Japan. The Yan'an years were also when Mao took firm and lasting control of the Chinese Communist Party itself. His method was the rectification campaign of 1942 to 1944, a sustained internal political campaign aimed at eliminating Soviet-style dogmatism, establishing Marxism adapted to Chinese conditions as the party's intellectual standard, and making clear to every member of the organization that correct thinking meant thinking as Mao did. The campaign involved intensive study of Mao's writings alongside critical texts on incorrect party behavior, followed by mandatory sessions of self-criticism in which participants confessed to ideological errors. These were not gentle conversations. The social pressure within small groups to produce adequate confessions was intense, and for some party members it extended to interrogation and detention. Hundreds of people were investigated as suspected spies or counter-revolutionaries, with results that ranged from rehabilitation to execution. What the rectification campaign produced, when it was done, was a party that had been remolded around a single ideological center. The 28 Bolsheviks and their Soviet-trained influence had been decisively displaced. Wang Ming, who had led them, was reduced to a marginal figure. The Seventh Party Congress in 1945 formally enshrined Mao Zedong thought in the party constitution as the guiding ideology, a step that no previous communist leader had taken in quite that form. The party had become, in a real sense, Mao's. His personal life had also reorganized itself during the Yan'an years. His Zizhen, who had suffered multiple wounds during the Long March and had lost the child she bore on the road, travelled to the Soviet Union for medical treatment in 1937 and effectively did not return. In 1939, Mao married Jiang Qing, a young actress from Shanghai who had come to Yan'an and worked her way into the political and personal circles around him. The senior party leadership was not enthusiastic. They allowed the marriage on the understanding that Jiang Qing would stay out of active politics. It was a promise that held for roughly 2 decades before it stopped holding entirely, with consequences that would affect tens of millions of people. Edgar Snow's book about his Yan'an visit, Red Star over China, published in 1937, reached enormous audiences in both the West and among overseas Chinese, presenting the communists as disciplined, idealistic reformers untouched by the corruption that was visibly eating the nationalist government. The portrait was not entirely wrong, but it was substantially incomplete. Snow was a good journalist who could only report what he was shown. What he was shown had been organized by people who understood the value of a favorable foreign correspondent. The Japan War was creating the conditions under which one side would eventually win China entirely. The nationalists were spending men and resources defending cities. The communists were expanding into the countryside behind Japanese lines, building administrative structures, training cadres, and adding to their army steadily. By 1945, when Japan surrendered, the communists had somewhere between 90,000 and 120,000 armed troops in 1937. They had over 900,000 by the war's end, plus a militia several times that size. The caves of Yan'an had been more productive than they looked. The final civil war, Japan's surrender in August of 1945, did not produce peace in China. It produced a race. Both the communists and the nationalists understood immediately that the end of the war was not the end of their conflict, but the starting gun for its final phase. Whoever moved fastest to occupy the territories Japan had held, the cities, the railways, the weapons depots, would hold the material advantage going into whatever came next. American transport planes began airlifting nationalist troops into major eastern cities within days of the surrender announcement. The communists, who controlled much of the countryside surrounding those cities, moved to intercept Japanese supply lines and collect abandoned equipment before the nationalists could reach it. In Manchuria, the Soviet Union, which had declared war on Japan in the final days of the conflict and swept through the region with its armies, occupied Japanese military installations and then, by arrangement and by informal transfer, handed substantial quantities of weapons and equipment to communist forces as they moved in. The nationalists, who had expected the Soviets to support their government as the recognized authority in China, watched this happen with considerable alarm and very little ability to stop it. Mao flew to Chongqing in late August of 1945 for negotiations with Chiang Kai-shek. The trip itself was a calculated piece of political theatre. Mao had not been on an airplane before and was not known for welcoming physical risk. But he went partly because refusing would have made the communists appear unwilling to pursue a peaceful settlement, and partly because he understood that the negotiations were less about reaching an agreement than about being seen to try. American Ambassador Patrick Hurley flew with him. The gesture of good faith was photographed extensively. The Chongqing negotiations lasted 6 weeks and produced a document called the Double Tenth Agreement, signed on the 10th of October, 1945, the same calendar date as the 1911 revolution, which both sides presumably found meaningful. The agreement promised a political consultative conference, a unified national army, and a constitutional government. It resolved essentially nothing. Both sides continued moving troops into contested areas while the ink was still wet. The gap between what the two parties were willing to concede was too large to bridge in any negotiation, and neither side trusted the other enough to make the concessions that might have mattered. The United States sent General George Marshall to China in December of 1945 to mediate a lasting settlement. Marshall was a serious man with genuine authority, and he devoted over a year to the effort. He produced a ceasefire in January of 1946 that lasted several months. He pressured both sides repeatedly. He achieved a temporary reduction in fighting that gave everyone a brief rest and changed nothing fundamental. By the middle of 1946, full-scale civil war had resumed, and Marshall returned to Washington in January of 1947. His mission failed, issuing a statement that blamed extremists on both sides for the breakdown. The nationalists held significant advantages at the outset. Their army was substantially larger, better equipped with American weapons including artillery and transport vehicles, and operated with air support that the communists could not match. The United States provided financial and military aid that amounted to several $1 billion over the course of the war. On paper, the contest looked uneven in the nationalists' favour. The paper proved unreliable. The nationalist military strategy concentrated on holding cities a choice, shaped partly by the political logic that controlling cities meant controlling visible, symbolic authority, and partly by the temperament of commanders who preferred defensible positions to the fluid mobile warfare that the communists practiced. This meant that nationalist forces tended to garrison urban centres while communist forces controlled the countryside surrounding them, which in turn meant that the nationalists were dependent on supply lines running through communist-controlled territory. It also meant that the communists could choose when and where to fight while the nationalists had to wait to be attacked. Land reform did the rest. Wherever communist forces moved into new territory, they implemented land redistribution, taking land from landlords and distributing it to poor farmers with a directness and speed that cut through years of accumulated rural resentment. Farmers, who had just received their own land for the first time, had a concrete, immediate reason to support the army that gave it to them. They provided intelligence, food, labour for transportation, and sons to the recruitment drives. The nationalist government had promised land reform for years and had consistently failed to deliver it because the landlord class was too embedded in the political structure that kept the nationalists functioning. By late 1947, the military balance was shifting. Lin Biao, a quiet, methodical commander who had been building the communist forces in Manchuria since the end of the Japanese War, had turned his army into one of the most effective fighting forces in China. His campaigns in Manchuria wore down the nationalist garrison force through a combination of siege, maneuver, and relentless pressure on supply lines. The nationalists poured reinforcements into Manchuria, tying down large numbers of their best troops in a theatre where the communists controlled most of the countryside and could sustain operations indefinitely while the cities slowly starved. Manchuria fell to Lin Biao's forces in late 1948 after a series of battles that encircled and destroyed nationalist armies that had been considered among Chiang Kai-shek's most reliable units. Several 100,000 nationalist troops were captured or defected. Then came Huaihai. The Battle of Huaihai, fought across the flat plains of Jiangsu and Anhui provinces from November of 1948 through January of 1949, was one of the largest land battles of the 20th century and one of the most decisive. Communist forces under the overall direction of Deng Xiaoping and Chen Yi encircled multiple nationalist army groups in a campaign that lasted 65 days. Approximately 500,000 nationalist troops were killed, wounded, or captured. The nationalist government had nothing left with which to defend central China. The battle broke the back of the organized nationalist military resistance in a way that could not be repaired. Beijing fell in January of 1949 without a fight. General Fu Zuoyi, commanding the nationalist garrison, negotiated a peaceful handover after weeks of pressure, accepting safe conduct for his forces rather than subjecting the city to a siege. It was a pragmatic decision that preserved Beijing's ancient buildings and monuments from the kind of damage that several other cities had suffered, which is the sort of consideration that becomes important when the outcome is not actually in doubt. Nanjing, the nationalist capital, fell in April. Chiang Kai-shek had already moved the government apparatus and the national treasury, along with a significant portion of China's gold reserves, to Taiwan. The retreat to the island had been in preparation for months. Shanghai fell in May. The communists swept through South and Southwest China over the summer and autumn, the remaining nationalist resistance crumbling province by province with a speed that surprised even the communist commanders. Chiang Kai-shek formally relocated the Republic of China government to Taipei, Taiwan, in December of 1949. He declared that this was a temporary measure and that his government would return to the mainland. He and his successors would maintain this position for decades. The return did not happen. In Washington, the fall of China to the communists generated an extended political crisis. The question of who lost China occupied American politics for years and contributed to the climate in which McCarthyism flourished. The framing of the question itself was revealing. It assumed China had been America's to lose, which was an interesting assumption about a country of 500 million people that had spent the better part of a century resisting the idea that foreign powers had rights over its internal affairs. On the communist side, the speed of the final victory had exceeded even optimistic projections. The civil war that most military observers in 1945 had expected to last for years had been decided substantially in 3 years. The reasons were military, political, economic, and social. The nationalist government had been losing not just battles, but the basic contest for legitimacy, corroded by inflation, corruption, and the accumulation of broken promises, while the communists had been building exactly the kind of administrative and military infrastructure that could sustain a long campaign. By September of 1949, Mao was in Beijing, in the old imperial city that had been the center of Chinese civilization for centuries, preparing to announce something that had not happened in China since the founding of the Republic 38 years earlier. A unified government was about to standing up. On the 1st of October, 1949, Mao Zedong stood on the rostrum above Tiananmen Gate, the Gate of Heavenly Peace, the southern entrance to the old imperial palace complex that emperors had used for centuries as the symbolic face of Chinese power, and declared the founding of the People's Republic of China to a crowd estimated at several 100,000 people gathered in the square below. He had already made the statement that would become the most quoted line of his career several days earlier. At the opening session of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference on the 21st of September, the Chinese people, he said, had stood up. The line landed differently depending on who heard it, but its basic meaning was understood across the country in the same way. The long period of national humiliation, the unequal treaties, the foreign concessions, the warlords, the Japanese occupation, the sense of a civilization that had lost control of its own fate was over. Whatever came next, it would be determined by Chinese people under Chinese leadership. The new government organized itself around the supremacy of the Chinese Communist Party, with Mao as chairman of both the party and the new state. Zhou Enlai became premier and foreign minister. Liu Shaoqi, the labor organizer from the Anyuan mine days, held a senior party position. The state structure was modeled broadly on Soviet lines, with ministries, planning bodies, and a military structure integrated into the party hierarchy. The nationalist alternative on Taiwan continued to claim legitimacy as the real government of China, but few powers outside the United States and its allies recognized that claim as practically meaningful. The first major foreign policy commitment came quickly. In February of 1950, Mao traveled to Moscow his first time outside China and negotiated the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance with Stalin. The treaty delivered Soviet technical assistance, loans, and a security guarantee. It also delivered Soviet advisors by the thousands engineers, military officers, and planners who arrived to help build the infrastructure of the new state. The relationship with Moscow was never entirely comfortable, partly because Stalin was not a man who treated any subordinate relationship as genuinely equal, and partly because Mao had achieved power through his own path rather than Soviet sponsorship, which meant he owed less than Stalin seemed to assume. Within China, the first major domestic campaign was land reform. The Land Reform Law of 1950 formalized and accelerated a process the communists had been practicing in their base areas for years. But the scale of implementation across a unified country of 500 million people was something different entirely. Land was seized from landlords, classified by a system of rural class designations that divided village populations into poor peasants, middle peasants, rich peasants, and landlords, and distributed to those at the bottom of the system. The process was not clean. In most villages, land reform included public accusation meetings assemblies at which landlords and accused class enemies were brought before their neighbours and subjected to criticism, denunciation, and judgment. Many were beaten. A significant number were executed. Estimates of the total deaths associated with land reform vary widely, but serious historians place the figure in the range of 1 to 2 million, with some estimates running considerably higher. For the hundreds of millions of farmers who received land they had previously worked for someone else, the reform was transformative in an immediate, concrete way. Land in your name, controlled by your family, meant something that no amount of political explanation could improve on. Rural support for the new government, which had been substantial in communist-controlled areas during the Civil War, deepened further. The marriage law of 1950 ran alongside the land reform campaign and addressed a different dimension of Chinese social structure. It outlawed arranged marriages, established the right of both parties to consent to or refuse a marriage, gave women the legal right to initiate divorce, and prohibited the purchase or sale of brides. The law was not uniformly enforced, particularly in rural areas where traditional marriage practices were deeply embedded, but it represented a formal break with the Confucian family structure that had governed Chinese domestic life for over 2,000 years. The change was real enough that it generated resistance in places where local officials found it more convenient to ignore the law than to enforce it. The Korean War interrupted and reshaped the new government's early priorities. When North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel in June of 1950, the United States intervened under United Nations authorization and drove the North Korean army back to the Chinese border by autumn. Mao made the decision to enter the war in October of 1950 over the strong objections of several senior colleagues who argued that the new government was not ready for a military confrontation with the United States. His reasoning combined genuine security concerns about American forces on the Yalu River border with a political calculation that China needed to demonstrate it could not be intimidated. Chinese forces, called the Chinese People's Volunteers, a designation that preserved the technical fiction that China and the United States were not at war, crossed into Korea in late October and drove the American-led forces back south in a series of offensives that genuinely surprised the American command. The war eventually stabilized near the original border, where it had started, and an armistice was signed in July of 1953. China had fought the most powerful military force in the world to a standstill. The cost was severe. Chinese casualties were somewhere between 180,000 and 400,000 killed, depending on the source, but the political effect domestically was exactly what Mao had calculated. The new government had proved it would fight. At home, the early 1950s saw a succession of mass campaigns that the new government used to consolidate control and reshape social behavior simultaneously. The campaign to suppress counter-revolutionaries, running alongside land reform, targeted former nationalist officials, suspected spies, and people classified as enemies of the new order. The Three Anti-campaign of 1951 went after corruption, waste, and excessive bureaucracy within the party and government itself, a signal that the new leadership understood that its own apparatus needed watching. The Five Anti-campaign followed shortly after, targeting capitalists and businessmen for bribery, tax evasion, fraud, and theft of state property. These campaigns were conducted through a combination of denunciation, public confession, and legal proceedings, with outcomes ranging from fines to execution depending on the severity of the accusations and the political temperature of the moment. The campaigns served multiple purposes beyond their stated objectives. They trained the population in the rituals of political participation that the new system required: the accusation meeting, the self-criticism session, the public demonstration of correct thought, and they established the pattern that mass mobilization could be deployed as a tool of governance. The population learned, in these early years, that political engagement was not optional, that silence could be as dangerous as dissent, and that the boundary between legitimate criticism and counter-revolutionary activity was determined by the party, not by any fixed legal standard. The physical landscape of the country was also being rebuilt. Soviet-assisted construction projects produced factories, power plants, railways, and dams at a pace that genuinely transformed industrial output. The first five-year plan, running from 1953 to 1957 and modelled closely on Soviet planning, achieved substantial industrial growth. Steel production increased. Coal output expanded. New rail lines were laid across regions that had had almost none. The statistics were real, even if the planning methods produced inefficiencies that would become more visible over time. By the mid-1950s, China looked, to outside observers and to many of its own people, like a country that had successfully stabilized after decades of war and disorder. The streets of Beijing and Shanghai were orderly. Crime had been reduced significantly through a combination of policing and the social pressure of neighborhood committees that monitored everyone's behavior. Literacy campaigns were underway. The inflation that had destroyed the nationalist government's credibility had been brought under control. There was food, broadly speaking, and there was work. The system that produced all of this was also a system without independent courts, without a free press, without political opposition of any kind, and with a demonstrated willingness to use mass violence against defined class enemies. These things existed simultaneously. Neither cancels the other out. Both belong to the same account. Mao was 55 years old in 1949, at the height of his political effectiveness, and presiding over a country that was, genuinely, recovering. The question of what he would do with the next decade was not yet answered. The experiments were about to begin. Steel, sparrows, and catastrophe. The mid-1950s were, by the standards of what had come before and what was coming next, a period of relative stability. The Korean War had ended. The land reform campaigns had run their course. The Soviet-assisted 5-year plan was producing measurable industrial growth. Mao, however, was not a man who found stability particularly comfortable. He was watching the Soviet Union, where Nikita Khrushchev had delivered a speech in February of 1956 that openly denounced Stalin's cult of personality, his purges, and his errors. The speech was supposed to be a closed-door address to party delegates and was almost immediately leaked to the wider world. It landed in Beijing with complicated weight. On one level, the de-Stalinization movement in Moscow validated Mao's long-standing view that the Soviet model should not be followed mechanically. On another level, a Communist Party officially dismantling the legacy of its founding leader raised questions that someone in Mao's position had every reason to find unsettling. His response, in part, was the 100 Flowers campaign of 1956 and 1957, an invitation to intellectuals, academics, and professionals to offer genuine criticism of the party's work, framed by the slogan, "Let 100 flowers bloom, let 100 schools of thought contend." The invitation appeared sincere. Whether it was, or whether it was a deliberate trap to identify critics who could then be dealt with, has been debated ever since. What is clear is that the criticism that emerged was far harsher and more widespread than the party leadership had expected. Intellectuals and academics who had held their tongues for years produced detailed critiques of party bureaucracy, ideological rigidity, and the suppression of independent thought. The campaign was reversed almost immediately. The anti-rightist movement of 1957 labelled everyone who had spoken out too freely as a rightist, a counter-revolutionary, and sent somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 people to labour camps, rural exile, or worse. Many of those purged were precisely the scientists, engineers, writers, and planners whose skills the country most needed. They would not return to productive work for years, if ever. The 100 Flowers campaign's legacy was a generation of educated Chinese who understood, with great precision, the cost of saying what they actually thought. Mao was already moving towards something far more ambitious. In 1958, he launched the Great Leap Forward, a campaign to transform China from an agricultural economy into an industrial power, not over decades, as conventional development would require, but within a few years, through the organized mobilization of the country's enormous population. The logic ran that what China lacked in technology and capital, it would compensate for in labor and revolutionary will. 500 million people, properly organized and properly motivated, could accomplish in months what other countries had taken generations to achieve. The agricultural side of the Great Leap involved the consolidation of the cooperative farms created in the early 1950s into enormous people's communes, units of 20,000 to 80,000 people that collectivized not just land, but effectively all aspects of rural life. Communal kitchens replaced family cooking. Private plots were abolished. Tools, animals, and household metal implements were pooled. The communes were governed by production quotas set by party officials who reported upward through a system that strongly discouraged admitting failure. The industrial side centered on the steel campaign. Mao had set a target of doubling steel production within a year, and the method chosen to achieve it was the construction of backyard steel furnaces across the entire country, small clay or brick kilns that ordinary farmers and factory workers would operate alongside their regular duties. Tens of millions of people built furnaces. Schools, offices, and villages were organized into steel-producing units. To meet the metal requirements of the furnaces, people melted down whatever iron and steel they possessed: cooking pots, farming tools, door hinges, and in some areas the metal fittings from ploughs and carts. The steel that came out of the backyard furnaces was mostly useless. Small-scale furnaces burning coal or wood at insufficient temperatures cannot produce the kind of steel required for industrial purposes. What they produced was brittle pig iron that could not be welded, machined, or used for construction. Warehouses accumulated piles of it. The targets were met on paper. In practice, the country had destroyed enormous quantities of functional farm equipment to produce metal that served no purpose at exactly the moment when the harvest needed every tool available. The Four Pests campaign ran simultaneously and addressed what party planners had identified as the four enemies of agricultural productivity: rats, flies, mosquitoes, and sparrows. The sparrow, it had been calculated, consumed significant quantities of grain and therefore represented a drain on food supplies that the revolution could not afford. Campaigns were organized across the country to eliminate sparrows entirely. People banged drums, waved flags, and chased the birds continuously until they dropped from exhaustion. Nests were destroyed. Eggs were smashed. The campaign was, by the narrow measure of sparrows killed, successful. It was also, by the broader measure of what happened next, a significant contribution to an ecological disaster. Sparrows eat insects as well as grain. With sparrows gone, insect populations, locusts in particular, exploded. Crops that survived the organizational chaos of the communes and the loss of farming tools were then devoured by insects that had previously been kept in balance by birds that no longer existed. The sparrow was eventually removed from the list and replaced by bedbugs, which had the advantage of not being part of any food chain that anyone depended on. Production reports flowing upward through the commune system were systematically inflated. Local officials who reported shortfalls risked being accused of sabotaging the revolution or of insufficient enthusiasm for the Great Leap. Officials who reported surpluses, even fabricated ones, were praised, promoted, and safe. The result was a cascade of false numbers moving up the reporting chain until they reached Beijing, where Mao and the central leadership received statistics showing a harvest so abundant that the country could apparently export grain while feeding itself generously. Grain exports continued as the famine began. In some areas, party officials collected grain from communes to meet export quotas while farmers starved. The famine that resulted from the combination of disrupted agriculture, destroyed farming tools, ecological imbalance, and false reporting began in earnest in 1959 and continued through 1961. Estimates of the death toll range from 15 million at the lowest scholarly assessments to 45 million at the highest, with most serious historians settling on a figure somewhere between 30 million and 38 million excess deaths. These are numbers that are genuinely difficult to process. They represent a catastrophe without close parallel in the 20th century in terms of absolute mortality, and it was caused not by drought alone, not by flood alone, not by enemy action, but by policy decisions and a political system that made honest reporting impossible. In July of 1959, the party held an enlarged conference at Lushan, in the mountains of Jiangxi province. Peng Dehuai, the defense minister and one of the military heroes of the Korean War, wrote a private letter to Mao, not a public denunciation, a personal communication intended only for Mao's eyes, in which he carefully laid out his concerns about the Great Leap. He noted the problems with the steel campaign, the disruption to agriculture, the inflated reporting. He expressed his concerns respectfully and with evident genuine loyalty to the party's larger goals. Mao chose to circulate the letter to the entire conference. He then delivered a speech in which he framed Peng's criticism as a political attack coordinated with foreign forces hostile to China and called on the party to choose between him and Peng. The framing left no real space for neutrality. Delegates who might privately have agreed with Peng's concerns calculated the costs of saying so and kept quiet. Peng Dehuai was dismissed as defense minister, publicly disgraced, and sent to do agricultural labor. He would not recover his position before his death. Lin Biao replaced him as defense minister. The Great Leap Forward, rather than being halted by the Lushan Conference, was reaffirmed and continued. the famine deepened, the retreat and the reckoning. By 1960, it was no longer possible for the senior leadership of the Chinese Communist Party to pretend that the great leap forward was going well. The famine was visible in every province. Party officials in the affected regions were filing reports that, even after the usual optimistic adjustments, described conditions that could not be explained as a temporary setback. Children were dying in rural communes at rates that local cadres could not suppress or reclassify. The central leadership was receiving enough honest information, filtering through the system despite everything, to understand the scale of what had happened. The Soviet Union's withdrawal of its technical advisors in the summer of 1960 added a second layer of crisis. Khrushchev, who had been growing increasingly irritated by Mao's public challenges to Soviet ideological authority, recalled all Soviet personnel from China, roughly 1,400 advisors and technicians, and cancelled hundreds of cooperative projects. They left with their blueprints in some cases, taking technical documentation that Chinese engineers would spend years reconstructing from memory and improvisation. The Sino-Soviet split, as it came to be known, was not yet an open rupture but was rapidly becoming one. China was now economically distressed, diplomatically isolated, and engaged in an increasingly public argument with the country that had been its primary foreign patron. Mao had already made one formal concession to the scale of the disaster. In April of 1959, before the Lushan Conference, he had relinquished the post of chairman of the People's Republic, the head of state position, to Liu Shaoqi. He retained his role as chairman of the Communist Party, which was the more powerful position, but the change meant that the day-to-day management of government increasingly ran through Liu and through Deng Xiaoping, who served as general secretary of the party. Mao described this arrangement as allowing him to withdraw to the second line, a step back from operational governance to focus on larger strategic questions. In practice, it meant that the men now running the recovery from the Great Leap's damage were doing things that Mao had not sanctioned and would not have approved. Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping were pragmatists of a different temperament from Mao. Where Mao believed that political will and ideological commitment could override material constraints, Liu and Deng were willing to let results determine method. Their recovery policies in 1961 and 1962 moved carefully but steadily away from the commune system's most damaging features. Private plots were restored to farming families. Commune sizes were reduced significantly, pushing decision-making back toward the village level where local knowledge could actually guide planting and harvesting decisions. Rural markets were reopened, allowing farmers to sell surplus produce privately. Output quotas were contracted back to individual households in some areas, effectively allowing families to farm their own land again as long as they met the state's requirements. Deng Xiaoping, explaining the pragmatic approach, used a phrase that would follow him for the rest of his career. It did not matter whether a cat was black or white, so long as it caught mice. The line was efficient and clear, and it described exactly the distance between how he thought about governance and how Mao did. Mao thought the colour of the cat was the entire point. The famine began to ease through 1962, though recovery was slow, and the rural population remained deeply damaged in ways that would persist for years. Exactly how many people had died became a question that the party's statistical apparatus was not designed to answer honestly, and serious demographic analysis of the famine's toll has been the work of scholars outside China operating on incomplete records ever since. In January and February of 1962, the party convened what became known as the 7,000 Cadres Conference, the largest internal party meeting in the history of the People's Republic, bringing together senior officials from across the country to assess what had gone wrong. Liu Shaoqi delivered a speech that, within the constrained vocabulary of party discourse, was remarkably direct. The disaster, he said, was 30% natural calamity and 70% man-made error. The phrase circulated widely and was understood by everyone present to mean exactly what it said. Mao sat on the stage during the conference and did not dominate proceedings in the way he had at previous gatherings. He made a self-criticism that acknowledged some responsibility without specifying what, exactly, he was responsible for. He appeared, to observers at the time, subdued. He was paying close attention. He later told colleagues that at the 7,000 cadres conference, and in the period that followed, he felt he was being treated like a dead ancestor, displayed with formal reverence at ceremonies, while his actual views were quietly set aside. The men managing the recovery were solving the problems he had caused with methods he found ideologically intolerable, and they were succeeding, which made it worse in a specific way. If their pragmatic policies had failed, he could have reasserted his position on principled grounds. The fact that the policies were working deprived him of that option. The Sino-Soviet split moved from private disagreement to public confrontation during 1963, when Chinese and Soviet parties exchanged open polemics, accusing each other of abandoning genuine Marxism-Leninism. The Soviet side accused China of adventurism and nationalism dressed up as doctrine. The Chinese side accused the Soviets of revisionism, of accommodating capitalism and American imperialism in the name of peaceful coexistence. Mao was the intellectual engine behind the Chinese position, and the argument suited him in several ways. It positioned China as the defender of true communist principles against a corrupted Soviet leadership, which strengthened his ideological authority domestically. It also explained and justified China's international isolation as a principled stance rather than a failure of diplomacy. The isolation had practical consequences. China was developing its nuclear weapons program without Soviet assistance, relying on its own physicists and engineers to solve problems that the Soviet advisors had taken with them when they left. On the 16th of October, 1964, China successfully detonated its first nuclear device at the Lopnor test site in Xinjiang. The test was a genuine technical achievement, accomplished under conditions of significant resource constraint. It announced China's arrival as a nuclear power and somewhat changed the strategic calculations of every government that dealt with it. Mao understood its symbolic weight precisely. The Socialist Education Campaign, which Mao launched in 1963 and ran through 1966, was his attempt to reassert ideological direction over a party that he felt had drifted during the recovery years. The campaign called for investigation of corruption and class deviation in the countryside, the renewal of revolutionary commitment among cadres who had grown comfortable, and a return to the principle that political consciousness, not mere technical competence, should guide governance. Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping managed the campaign's implementation in ways that redirected it toward rural corruption and bureaucratic problems, practical targets that produced practical results, and pulled it away from the broader ideological confrontation with pragmatism that Mao had intended. By 1965, the two directions were no longer reconcilable. Mao had spent several years watching the party organization he had built operate in ways he considered a betrayal of everything the revolution was supposed to mean. Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping were competent administrators who believed that China's primary task was material development and that ideology served material development rather than the other way around. Mao believed the opposite with the same intensity that he had believed things all his life, and he was not a man who left unresolved conflicts sitting indefinitely on the table. He had, over the previous years, been cultivating relationships outside the regular party and government structure. Lin Biao, now defense minister, had been systematically building Mao's personal cult within the People's Liberation Army, introducing intensive study of Mao's writings as a central feature of military training and producing the Little Red Book, the quotations from Chairman Mao, as a daily reference for soldiers. Jiang Qing, Mao's wife, had been working in Shanghai's cultural apparatus, building relationships with radical writers and theatre critics who shared her view that Chinese culture needed to be purged of bourgeois and feudal influences. The instruments of what was coming were already being assembled. Mao was pulling himself back from the second line, and he was not intending to arrive quietly. The revolution devours itself. The opening move was a theatre review. In November of 1965, a writer named Yao Wenyuan published a long critical article in a Shanghai newspaper attacking a historical play called Hai Rui, Dismissed from Office, written by a Beijing historian named Wu Han. The play told the story of a Qing Dynasty official who was removed from his post for honestly criticizing the emperor. Yao's article argued that the play was not really about the Ming dynasty at all. It was a thinly veiled defense of Peng Dehuai. The General Mao had purged at Lushan in 1959 for writing him an honest letter. The attack had been arranged by Jiang Qing, operating through her Shanghai connections, with Mao's knowledge and approval. Wu Han was a deputy mayor of Beijing. The Beijing party establishment, run by Peng Zhen, a senior figure who had been in the party since the 1920s, initially tried to limit the damage, treating the article as a literary dispute rather than a political crisis. This was the wrong reading of what was happening. Mao was not interested in a literary dispute. The article was the first public piece of what would become the Cultural Revolution, and Peng Zhen's attempt to manage it placed him squarely in its path. By May of 1966, the situation was moving fast. An internal party document known as the May 16th Circular was distributed, formally launching the Cultural Revolution and identifying unnamed representatives of the bourgeoisie who have sneaked into the party as the primary target. The circular was Mao's declaration of war on the party structure that Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping represented. Peng Zhen was removed from his positions within days. At Peking University, a philosophy lecturer named Ni Yuanzi posted a large handwritten wall poster at Dazibao on the 25th of May, attacking the university's leadership as counter-revolutionary suppressors of the student movement. Wall posters were a traditional form of Chinese public communication, and Ni's was not the first one critical of authority to appear that spring. But Mao read it, praised it as the first Marxist-Leninist big character poster in China, and had it broadcast nationally on radio. The effect was immediate. Across university campuses in Beijing and then across the country, students began posting their own Dazibao, denouncing teachers, administrators, and party officials. Schools and universities suspended classes. Students organized themselves into Red Guard units. The name had appeared spontaneously at the middle school, attached to Tsinghua University in late May, and spread rapidly. The Red Guards wore military-style green uniforms, red armbands, and carried small red copies of the quotations from Chairman Mao, the little red book that Lin Biao's army had been distributing for years, and that was now the central liturgical object of a movement that had some of the organizational features of a religious revival and the social dynamics of a large-scale mob. On the 18th of August, 1966, Mao appeared at Tiananmen Square at dawn, wearing a Red Guard armband given to him by a student named Song Binbin. 1 million young people had been brought to Beijing for the occasion. They had travelled from across the country, many of them having walked or ridden on the roofs of trains because the transport system could not handle the volume, and they stood in the square for hours in August heat waiting for the moment when Mao appeared on the rostrum above the gate. The response, by every account, was overwhelming. Young people wept, they screamed, they held their little red books above their heads. It was the largest of 8 mass rallies Mao held that summer and autumn, attended in total by approximately 11 million Red Guards. The effect on the young people who participated was difficult to overstate. Many of them had grown up in a system that treated Mao as something between a historical force and a divine presence, and actually seeing him, even from hundreds of meters away, produced responses that went well beyond ordinary political enthusiasm. Mao had decided to use this force to break the party structure that had been managing China without him. He would later describe it as mobilizing one class to overthrow another, But the practical dynamic was simpler. He was sending millions of teenagers, armed with his authority and their own certainty, into every institution in the country to find and destroy the people he had decided were his enemies. The campaign against the four old customs, old culture, old habits, old ideas gave the Red Guards a mandate of extraordinary breadth. Any object, practice, or person connected to pre-revolutionary culture was potentially a target. Red Guard units raided homes searching for books, artworks, jewelry, religious objects, or any sign of bourgeois or feudal attachment. Temples and monasteries were ransacked. Statues were smashed. Centuries-old artworks were burned in courtyard bonfires alongside private libraries. Street names with historical or foreign associations were changed in some cities. Streets were renamed after revolutionary slogans, creating navigation challenges that nobody at the time was in a position to complain about. Teachers and professors were particular targets. The category of stinking intellectual had existed in party discourse for years as a mild disparagement of people who thought more than they worked. Under the Cultural Revolution, it became an accusation with real consequences. Teachers across China were subjected to struggle sessions pituzheng, in which students and colleagues denounced them publicly, forcing them to stand in bent positions for hours wearing dunce caps and boards listing their crimes, while crowds shouted accusations and sometimes threw things. Significant numbers were beaten. Many were sent to the countryside or to labour camps for what was officially called re-education through labour. An unknown but large number were killed outright or died as a result of the treatment they received. Others took their own lives. The writer Lao She, one of the most important Chinese novelists of the 20th century, died in August of 1966 under circumstances that have never been fully clarified. He was 67 years old. Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping were not spared. In the summer of 1966, they had attempted to manage the early Red Guard movement by sending work teams into universities to direct the criticism, a response that tried to bring the movement under the party's organizational control. Mao withdrew his support for the work teams in late July and accused them of suppressing the revolutionary students. This was the political equivalent of pulling a floor out from underneath two people who thought they were standing on solid ground. Liu Shaoqi was publicly labelled China's Khrushchev, a reformist traitor within the party who had been steering China toward capitalism while wearing a communist face. He was subjected to struggle sessions, stripped of his positions, and placed under house arrest with his wife. His diabetic condition required medication. The medication was not provided. He died in November of 1969 in a disused building in Kaifeng, alone, wrapped in newspapers for warmth, his identity so thoroughly concealed that the staff of the building did not know who he was. He was 71 years old. Deng Xiaoping was luckier in the immediate sense. He was stripped of his positions and sent to work in a tractor repair factory in Jiangxi province, living in a small house with his wife and doing physical labor. His son, Deng Pufang, was thrown from a window at Peking University during a Red Guard interrogation. Whether pushed or jumped to escape further treatment is disputed, and was left paralyzed from the waist down. Schools and universities across China closed entirely in 1966. They would remain closed, in most cases, for several years. A generation of students who should have been completing secondary and university education instead spent those years in revolutionary activities, at construction sites, or in rural villages, as part of later campaigns to send educated youth to the countryside. The disruption to education, science, medicine, and professional training across an entire generation would take decades to fully measure. What had been set in motion had no obvious mechanism for stopping itself. The Red Guards had authority derived directly from Mao, which meant no institution below Mao could legitimately restrain them. And Mao, watching from Beijing, showed no inclination to turn it off. Chaos becomes the system. The Cultural Revolution had been designed as a weapon aimed at specific targets, Liu Shaoqi, Deng Xiaoping, and the party apparatus they represented. What it became, within months of its launch, was something considerably harder to steer. By late 1966 and into 1967, the Red Guard movement had fragmented into competing factions that were no longer united by anything except their claim to be the most authentically revolutionary force in their particular city, campus, or factory. Each faction accused the others of being covert counter-revolutionaries, class enemies, or secret agents of one disgraced official or another. The accusations were almost entirely without basis, but the logic of the movement created no mechanism for distinguishing real enemies from invented ones, and the social pressure to prove revolutionary credentials through aggressive action meant that finding enemies even among other Red Guards was both necessary and relatively easy. The factional disputes escalated from verbal confrontation to physical violence to, in some regions, outright armed combat. Red Guard units raided military armories and provincial weapons depots. In the city of Wuzhou in Guangxi province, rival factions conducted artillery duels across the city. In Chongqing, fighting between factions left parts of the industrial city resembling a war zone. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed in factional violence across the country during 1967 and 1968. Though the full accounting has never been possible because the records were either not kept or were destroyed afterward. In Shanghai, in January of 1967, radical workers and students seized control of the city's party apparatus in what became known as the January Storm. The Shanghai Municipal Committee was overthrown and replaced by a revolutionary committee, a new administrative structure that mixed Red Guards, radical workers, and military representatives. Mao endorsed the Shanghai model enthusiastically and called on other provinces and cities to follow it. Revolutionary committees spread across the country, replacing existing party and government bodies in a wave of institutional demolition that left China's administrative structure in genuine disarray. The People's Liberation Army was drawn in to try to maintain enough order for the country to keep functioning. Lin Biao directed military units to support the left, which in practice meant different things in different places, since local commanders made their own judgments about which faction represented the authentic left and which represented a counter-revolutionary disguise. The army's involvement deepened the factional conflicts in many areas rather than resolving them, as military backing became another prize that competing factions competed for. In February of 1967, a group of senior party veterans men, who had been in the revolution since before Mao was in charge, and who held positions on the State Council, gathered at a series of Politburo meetings and expressed direct criticism of the PRO's Cultural Revolution's direction. Chen Yi, the foreign minister, Ye Jianying, Tan Zhenlin, Li Fuchun. They argued that the attacks on party veterans, the destruction of administrative structures, and the violence sweeping the country represented a betrayal of everything the revolution had achieved. Tan Zhenlin reportedly slammed his hand on the table. It was the kind of meeting where senior men who had survived the Long March and the Civil War and the Korean War could not quite believe what they were watching happen to the country they had spent their lives building. The meeting was reported to Mao. The participants were denounced as the February adverse current and subjected to criticism campaigns. The message delivered to every surviving senior official was clear and was not misunderstood. The attack extended outward into areas that even the Cultural Revolution's designers had perhaps not fully anticipated. In August of 1967, Red Guard groups seized control of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Beijing, going through files and issuing their own communications in the name of the Chinese government. The British mission in Beijing was attacked and burned, with British diplomats barely escaping. China's diplomatic relationships with multiple countries were disrupted or severed entirely as revolutionary zealots with no training in international affairs briefly ran foreign policy from behind barricades in a ministry they had occupied. It took the army weeks to dislodge them. Cultural life in China during the Cultural Revolution years was not merely constrained. it was reduced in most of the country to 8 things. Jiang Qing had developed what she called the 8 model revolutionary works, a set of approved operas, ballets, and symphonic pieces that represented the only culturally acceptable productions in a country of hundreds of millions of people. These 8 works were performed continuously in every city. Every theatre, every cultural troupe, every evening performance, the same 8 pieces, across a country of approximately 750 million people for a period of roughly a decade. A person attending live performance in China between the late 1960s and the mid-1970s had exactly 8 options, regardless of where they lived or what they preferred, which is either a remarkable act of cultural curation or a sign that something had gone seriously wrong, depending on one's perspective. Traditional opera, considered feudal, was prohibited. Classical literature that had not been specifically approved was confiscated and burned. Historical temples, already damaged in the early Red Guard raids, continued to suffer. The Confucian temple complex in Khufu, birthplace of Confucius, a site of continuous cultural significance for over 2,000 years, was attacked by Red Guards who smashed statues, dug up graves, and destroyed artifacts. The attack on Khufu lasted over a month. By 1968, Mao had concluded that the Red Guards had served their primary purpose. Liu Shaoqi was neutralized. The party structure had been sufficiently dismantled that rebuilding it would require starting largely from scratch under his direction. But the Red Guards were now a problem in themselves, factionalized, violent, impossible to direct, and disrupting the industrial and agricultural production that even a revolutionary economy required. They needed to be dealt with. The solution was the countryside. Mao issued a directive calling on educated urban youth to go to rural villages to receive re-education from the poor and middle peasants. The movement was presented as a positive program, young people volunteering to learn from the masses. In practice, it was a forced dispersal of a social force that had become unmanageable. Worker and soldier propaganda teams were sent into universities and schools to restore order, and the Red Guard organizations were formally dissolved. Military control was established over campuses and urban neighborhoods where factional fighting had continued. Over the following years, approximately 17 million young people were sent from cities to rural villages, farms, and frontier regions. They were called the Zhiqing, the educated youth. Most had no agricultural skills. Most had been Red Guards weeks or months earlier, traveling the country on the strength of Mao's personal authority. Now they were digging fields and tending pigs in remote Shaanxi villages or Yunnan rubber plantations, in many cases hundreds of miles from their families, with no clear timeline for return. A significant number would remain in the countryside for a decade or more. The disruption to their education, careers, and family lives produced a generation's worth of damage that Chinese society would take a long time to reckon with. The Ninth Party Congress, held in April of 1969, formally consolidated the Cultural Revolution's political outcomes. Lin Biao's position as Mao's closest comrade in arms and designated successor was written into the new party constitution, an extraordinary step that made the succession question public in a way it had never been before in the party's history. The Congress also confirmed the new Politburo, which was dominated by Cultural Revolution figures and from which most of the old party veterans had been removed or excluded. The party that emerged from the Ninth Congress was, structurally, very different from the one that had governed China before 1966. Mao had remade it around himself so thoroughly that its functioning was now entirely dependent on his continued health, attention, and authority. That dependency would become, in the years ahead, a different kind of problem. Nixon, Lin Biao, and the cracking world. Lin Biao had been the most visible beneficiary of the Cultural Revolution's political reshuffling. His position as Mao's designated successor, enshrined in the party constitution at the Ninth Congress, gave him a formal status that no figure in the party's history had previously held. He was photographed at Mao's side at every significant occasion. His name appeared alongside Mao's in every official formulation. The little red book his army had produced had become the defining cultural object of the age, and his introduction to the first edition, full of extravagant praise for Mao's genius, had been read aloud by hundreds of millions of people. By 1971, the relationship between the two men had deteriorated to the point of mutual suspicion. The specific reasons are still not entirely clear, and the official Chinese account of events has never been fully credible. What the evidence suggests is that Lin Biao or his son Lin Liguo, or both, with different degrees of planning and intent, were involved in discussions about what to do if Mao decided to move against the Lin family. Whether this constituted a genuine plot to assassinate Mao, as the official account insists, or a more defensive contingency planning exercise that was discovered before anyone acted on it, remains disputed. What is not disputed is what happened on the night of the 13th of September, 1971. A British-made Trident jet took off from an airfield in Inner Mongolia carrying Lin Biao, his wife Ye Kun, his son Lin Liguo, and several others. The plane flew north into Mongolian airspace. Sometime in the early hours of the 14th, it crashed in the desert near a town called Underkhan in the Mongolian People's Republic. Everyone aboard died. Mongolian authorities found the wreckage and the bodies within hours. The Chinese government said nothing publicly for weeks. National Day on the 1st of October came and went without the usual photographs of Lin Biao at Mao's side, without the usual formulations that had paired their names together for 2 years, without explanation. People who paid attention to such things noticed. People who paid less attention found out later, when the party began the process of explaining to its membership what had happened to the man whose name had been written into the party constitution as the next leader of China. The explanation offered that Lin Biao had been a traitor all along, a hidden agent of both the Soviet Union and the Kuomintang simultaneously, who had conspired against Mao from inside the revolution, required a level of retroactive credulity that strained even the considerable capacity for ideological adjustment that the previous decade had developed in the Chinese. Population. Lin Biao had been Mao's closest comrade in arms for years. He had appeared in every political ritual, every official photograph. Either the party's vetting system had failed completely and repeatedly, or the explanation was incomplete. The second option was closer to the truth, but it was not the option that could be stated publicly. Mao's response to the Lin Biao affair was a complicated private grief. By several accounts, his health deteriorated significantly in the weeks after the crash, not from any specific new illness, but from the accumulated effect of a shock he had not been fully prepared for. The man he had elevated above everyone else in the party had apparently chosen to run rather than face whatever he believed Mao was preparing to do to him. Whether this was an accurate reading of Mao's intentions is another question that cannot be fully answered. While the Lin Biao crisis was still being managed internally, a different kind of transformation was underway in China's relationship with the world. The logic that drove it was straightforward, even if its execution was remarkable. The Soviet Union and China were, by the early 1970s, genuine adversaries. Border clashes along the Ussuri River in 1969 had left dozens of soldiers dead on both sides. The Soviet military buildup on the Chinese border was substantial. Mao had concluded that the Soviet threat to China was more immediate than the American one, and that a diplomatic opening to the United States could serve as a strategic counterweight. The signal came in April of 1971 through the improbable medium of table tennis. An American table tennis team competing in Japan received an unexpected invitation to visit China, the first group of Americans permitted entry to the People's Republic in over 2 decades. They toured, played, and shook hands on camera with Zhou Enlai. The term ping-pong diplomacy was coined by journalists who could not quite believe what they were covering. Henry Kissinger, President Nixon's national security advisor, flew secretly to Beijing in July of 1971, arriving through Pakistan in an arrangement that kept the visit entirely off the official record until it was over. He spent 2 days in direct conversations with Zhou Enlai, and returned to Washington with the framework for something that had seemed, until days before it happened, essentially unimaginable. Nixon announced publicly that he would visit China. The announcement was a genuine geopolitical shock. The United States had refused to recognize the People's Republic since 1949. Nixon himself had built significant parts of his earlier political career on anti-communist credentials. The reversal was so dramatic and so complete that it could only have been executed by someone whose anti-communist record was beyond challenge, which was, in fact, part of the calculation. Nixon arrived in Beijing on the 21st of February, 1972. He was taken to meet Mao that same afternoon, a meeting that had been presented as possibly not happening, since Mao's health was publicly uncertain, and which lasted approximately 65 minutes in Mao's book-lined study at Zhongnanhai. Mao was visibly unwell. He moved with difficulty and spoke in a manner that required Zhou Enlai's assistance to interpret, not just translate. He had been suffering from what Chinese doctors had diagnosed variously, but which Western physicians, who later reviewed the records, concluded was most likely amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, a progressive motor neuron disease that was gradually affecting his ability to speak and move. The conversation reportedly covered philosophy, history, and geopolitical generalities rather than specific agreements. Nixon, who had spent his career cultivating the image of a hard-nosed pragmatist, appeared genuinely awed by the meeting in a way that his prepared notes had not quite accounted for. Mao, for his part, managed the encounter with the kind of controlled display of presence that he had been practicing since the Yan'an cave years, projecting authority from a position of physical difficulty in a way that required considerable effort and considerable skill. The Shanghai Communiqué, signed at the end of the visit, committed both sides to a gradual normalization of relations and established the diplomatic framework that would govern the relationship for decades. The United States acknowledged that there was one China and that Taiwan was part of China, a formulation careful enough to avoid resolving the question while allowing both sides to move forward. American forces would be progressively withdrawn from Taiwan. The geopolitical impact was significant and immediate. The Soviet Union, watching the United States and China align against it diplomatically, faced a strategic problem that had not existed a year earlier. The triangular relationship between Washington, Beijing, and Moscow that emerged from Nixon's visit became one of the defining structures of the 1970s Cold War. Within China, the Cultural Revolution was not over but was entering a different phase. Zhou Enlai, operating from his position as premier with Mao's intermittent approval, had managed to rehabilitate some of the officials purged in the late 1960s. Deng Xiaoping was brought back from his tractor factory in Jiangxi in 1973 and restored to a vice-premier position, a rehabilitation that Mao approved, partly because the administrative demands of running the country required experienced people, and partly because the Lin Biao affair had reminded him that elevating any single successor figure carried its own risks. Zhou Enlai was diagnosed with bladder cancer in 1972. He continued working, managing enormous amounts of government business from hospital as his condition worsened, a figure of remarkable personal discipline operating under conditions that would have incapacitated most people. Around Mao, a group of radical Cultural Revolution figures had consolidated their influence over cultural and propaganda affairs. Jiang Qing, Zhang Chunqiao, Yao Wenyuan, and a young Shanghai worker turned official named Wang Hongwen formed the group that would later be called the Gang of Four, though nobody used that name while Mao was alive. They competed with Zhou Enlai and the rehabilitated officials for Mao's ear, and the last years of Mao's life were shaped by the tension between these two factions pulling in opposite directions. Mao himself was increasingly confined. His eyesight was failing. His speech was difficult to understand without trained interpreters. He received visitors in his private quarters rather than in formal meeting rooms. The man who had addressed 1 million Red Guards from Tiananmen was now largely invisible, the source of pronouncements that others carried to the world on his behalf. The revolution he had made was outlasting his ability to direct it. The long silence at the end. In the last years of Mao's life, his world had contracted to a few rooms. He lived in his private quarters at Zhongnanhai, the compound of government buildings and gardens adjacent to the old imperial palace in Beijing, and received visitors there rather than in formal state settings. His eyesight had deteriorated badly enough that cataract surgery was performed in 1975, and while his vision improved somewhat afterward, the physical effort of reading something he had done compulsively his entire life, surrounding himself with books in every residence since the cave years at Yan'an, had become difficult in a way that clearly wore on him. His speech was the harder problem. The motor neuron disease that had been progressing since the early 1970s had affected the muscles of his throat and mouth. What came out when he tried to speak had become increasingly difficult for most people to understand. He relied on a personal assistant named Zhang Yufeng, a young woman from his private staff who had spent enough time around him to interpret his speech for visitors, including foreign heads of state, who sat across from the most powerful man in China and needed a second person to tell them what he had just said. Despite this, Mao continued to see foreign visitors through 1974 and into 1975. He met with American President Gerald Ford in December of 1975 in an encounter that lasted approximately 90 minutes. Participants described a man who was clearly diminished physically, but who still managed to project something, a quality of attention, or simply the accumulated weight of what he represented, that made the meetings feel consequential even when the conversation was mostly elliptical. Within the party, the competition between factions had not resolved. Deng Xiaoping, restored to a vice premier position in 1973, had been steadily expanding his effective control over day-to-day governance under Zhou Enlai's guidance. Zhou was managing his cancer treatment alongside enormous volumes of government work, keeping his illness largely private in the way that senior Chinese officials of his generation tended to manage personal difficulty. Deng's pragmatic approach to economic recovery, his willingness to prioritize results over ideological purity, alarmed the Cultural Revolution radicals around Jiangqing, who saw his return as a threat to everything the previous decade had established. Zhou Enlai died on the 8th of January, 1976. He was 78 years old. The public mourning was immediate and widespread, partly because Zhou had genuinely been loved in a way that was different from the fear and reverence that surrounded Mao, and partly because his death was understood by many Chinese to represent the passing of a figure who had, through careful management, limited some of the worst impulses of the Cultural Revolution years. The Gang of Four moved quickly to suppress public expressions of grief that seemed too enthusiastic, correctly reading them as implicitly critical of the political direction they represented. The Qingming Festival, the traditional day for mourning the dead, falling in early April, provided the occasion for something the party had not managed to prevent. In the days before the 4th of April, ordinary citizens began bringing wreaths and flowers to Tiananmen Square to commemorate Zhou Enlai. The flowers accumulated. People came to read the poems and tributes others had left. What started as a gesture of grief began to acquire a political dimension that the central leadership found alarming. The mourning for Zhou was also, quite visibly, an expression of discontent with the current direction. On the night of the 4th of April, militia forces cleared the square and removed everything that had been left there. The following day, the 5th of April, crowds gathered again and encountered the empty monument. The resulting confrontation, crowds and militia, accusations and arrests became known as the Tiananmen Incident. Several people were killed, many more were detained. The Gang of Four successfully convinced Mao that Deng Xiaoping had organized the incident as a deliberate political provocation. Mao, who was by this point receiving information primarily through the filter of people around him who had their own interests in how that information was shaped, accepted the interpretation. Deng was stripped of all his positions for the second time and sent back into internal exile. Hua Guofeng, a relatively obscure party official from Hunan, who had risen partly through his connection to Mao's home province, was appointed first vice-chairman of the party and premier, a dual position that made him the formal designated successor. Then the earth moved. On the 28th of July, 1976, a catastrophic earthquake struck the city of Tangshan in Hebei province, approximately 90 miles east of Beijing. It happened at 3:42 in the morning, when most of the city was asleep. Tangshan was an industrial city of about 1 million people, built on a coal basin, with construction standards that offered almost no protection against a major seismic event. The official death toll was set at 242,000, a number that most analysts consider a significant undercount. The actual death toll was probably closer to 500,000. In traditional Chinese cosmology, a framework that had been officially repudiated by the Communist Party but had never quite stopped shaping how people thought about catastrophe, major earthquakes were associated with the fall of dynasties. The Tangshan earthquake, coming in the same year as the deaths of Zhou Enlai and the veteran military commander Zhu De, was interpreted by many ordinary Chinese, quietly and privately, as a sign that something fundamental was ending. They were not wrong. Mao Zedong died at 12 minutes past midnight on the 9th of September, 1976. He was 82 years old. The cause was recorded as a heart attack, though the motor neuron disease had been the longer process that had brought him to that condition. The announcement was made to the Chinese people on the afternoon of the 9th, read over radio and television in the measured official tones that the party used for news that required the country to process something enormous and proceed without panic. The Gang of Four moved to consolidate control in the immediate aftermath. They did not have enough time. On the 6th of October, 1976, less than a month after Mao's death, Hua Guofeng and senior military figures arrested Jiang Qing, Zhang Chunqiao, Yao Wenyuan, and Wang Hongwen in a single coordinated action. The arrests happened during what the four had expected to be a routine meeting. Jiang Qing, by the accounts of those present, demanded to know by whose authority she was being detained. The answer was that it had been decided by the party. It was the kind of answer that, from the other side of the table, she had delivered many times herself. The Cultural Revolution was declared officially over. The Gang of Four were eventually tried in a public proceeding that lasted through 1980 and 1981, in which Jiang Qing delivered defiant courtroom speeches, insisting that she had only done what Mao had directed. This was, by most accounts, substantially true, and it was also entirely beside the point of the verdict that had already been determined before the trial began. Deng Xiaoping returned from his second exile and, by 1978, had consolidated enough authority to launch the reform program that would transform China from a closed planned economy into the largest manufacturing economy in the world within 3 decades. He did this by doing precisely what Mao had spent the Cultural Revolution trying to prevent, subordinating ideology to results, opening the economy to markets, inviting foreign investment, and telling the Chinese people that getting rich was compatible with socialism. Whether this represented the completion of Mao's revolution or its dismantling depended on which part of Mao's legacy one chose to emphasize. The official party verdict on Mao, delivered by Deng Xiaoping and formalized in a 1981 resolution, was 70% correct, 30% wrong. His contributions to the founding of the People's Republic and the consolidation of Chinese sovereignty were credited. The Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution were acknowledged as serious errors. The formulation was careful enough to preserve the party's continuity with its own history while establishing a firm distance from its worst chapters. Mao's portrait still hangs above Tiananmen Gate. his face still appears on Chinese currency. His mausoleum sits in the square below the portrait where his body lies preserved, visited by millions of people every year who queue for the experience of passing through the same space as his remains. What they are there to see or feel or settle in themselves about the man and the century he shaped that is not uniform. China has not resolved its reckoning with Mao, and perhaps cannot, because the reckoning would require the party to account fully for a history it is still made of. He was born in a village in Hunan, where a boy with a pile of borrowed novels lay in a corner reading stories about men who overthrew unjust rulers. The world he died in was unrecognizable from that village, and he had done more than any single other person to make it so. Whether that was a good thing, and how much of it was good and how much catastrophic, is a calculation that depends on which Chinese person you ask, and on which decade of their life you are asking them in. The rice fields of Shaoshan are still green. Settle in now. The story has found its end, or at least the place where the telling stops. Mao Zedong lived for 82 years, across one of the most turbulent centuries any country has ever passed through. A lot happened. You followed it all the way here. If you are still awake, there is another journey waiting for you on the screen right now. Just reach over and let it carry you forward. And if tonight's story was one you found worth your time, a like or a subscribe means a lot, or leave a thought in the comments below. For now, let your body go heavy. Close your eyes. The story is done for the night. Good night.